Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of how joking about evil can make you evil. Although I should point out, not in a deterministic sense, that like if you tell a joke about evil, therefore you inescapably will become evil. You know, obviously not anything that ridiculous. But rather, that it predisposes you. It doesn't make you in a sufficient sense. It's not the only thing required, but rather it does push you in that direction and makes it easier to go in that direction. So, now there are two kinds of evil, generally called sins of omission and sins of commission, but, basically evil that you actively do and evil that there is good that you should do that you don't do. They're not actually, it's a useful distinction, but they're not as different, as we often like to think. And so I'm going to kind of lump them together and only distinguish where necessary. But so what I say really does apply to both. So there are, the one other caveat I need is that I'm talking about where a person becoming evil, where a person doesn't want to become evil, or that becoming evil is not their explicit goal. If becoming evil is your explicit goal, that is to say, if choosing the worse instead of the better is what you want to do, if you will to not choose the best but to choose a lesser good, knowingly, well, you'll accomplish that. So you don't need any help at that point. So that's not an issue. I'm talking only about in that case where a person is not explicitly trying to choose the worse, that joking about evil can lead you down there. So, what is it about choosing a lesser good over a greater good, which is essentially what evil consists of? Sometimes a very, very lesser good over a much greater good, sometimes, closer. How does that work? It's the sort of the first question we need to ask to make it clear how the joking can help, can get you there. So, there's sort of two parts to it. The first of which is the misapprehension of the lesser good over the greater good. Now, one of the easiest ways of doing this is what you could call hyperfocus, overfocus, paying too much attention. That is to say, to look at the lesser good and to look at it to such a degree that one doesn't pay any attention to the greater good. It's a spectrum. So paying far too much attention and far too little will do a lot. Paying all your attention to one thing and none to the greater will sort of do a stronger job. But it's on that spectrum. So one thing is paying far too much attention to a lesser good. Another thing is ignoring warning signs that you're getting it wrong. There are in life all sorts of red flags that you're doing something incorrectly. And so it's not just a matter of doing the evil thing, but also of ignoring all the, all these signs of doing good. I'm sorry, that you're not doing good. So, for example, a simple thing like if you are, let's take something really, really clear. Okay, you're a slave owner. Nice and evil, right? Very clear. So, directly you are misapprehending the good of, you want lots of your crops tended in the field, right? So there's that good. You're focusing on that good to the exclusion of the good of the human being whom you're exploiting. You see only the natural virtue of his strength and his ability to understand and follow directions and so on, and not anything like his human dignity and, which is vastly more important. Okay, so there's the mistake where you're focusing on a lesser good to the exclusion of the greater good. But there are also a bunch of red flags that should pop up as well, such as the fact that the slave doesn't want to, and then you resort to beating him. And again, your eyes are focused on that very small good of, getting compliance and, again, in violation of the dignity of the human being, which is the much, much greater good. But, for example there, while you are, whipping your slave, you're ignoring his cries of pain, which are red flags that something's really not the way it should be. And so you harden your heart and just ignore that. So there's the red flag that you're ignoring in order to maintain your focus on the much lesser good to the exclusion of the much, much greater good. Okay, so sort of to concretize what I mean by those two different portions. Now, most things in life are not that simple. I mean, there were plenty of slave owners throughout history, so it's not a fanciful example. But in the modern modern English speaking world, especially, although many people speak English as a second language and so on, but especially in the West, in a lot of my audience is in America, and it's the cultural reference I tend to use. We don't own slaves in America, and especially not explicitly, and so the that's kind of an extreme example, but for any evil, that same basic thing applies. There is a focus on the lesser good to the exclusion of a greater good, and there's the ignoring of warning flags. Now, warning flags are sometimes as obvious as a person crying out in pain or something like that, but they're very often of the form of things like knowing that other people would disapprove. So you get raised with the idea that people don't do this. The people around you don't do this. You don't see anybody doing this. Anything where people don't do it, you feel a little bit off about. It's largely an animal reaction, but nonetheless, if the people around you don't do something, you feel a little iffy about doing it. And that feeling is itself a red flag that maybe you shouldn't be doing this. By no means an infallible red flag, but it is. And similarly, there are things that they look down upon people for. So the people around you will occasionally talk about how awful somebody was for doing something bad. That forms, a basis essentially of shame, and that shame can be very useful as a red flag that you should not be doing that evil thing either. So, to take a unfortunately fairly common example, a person cheating on his wife, or a woman cheating on her husband. There is a fair amount of shame that attaches to this. People gossip about it. Not that gossip is good, but nonetheless, it does serve as that red flag that this is something bad. You know that people would talk about it. You know that family members will look at you strangely and not want to spend as much time with you and so on if they find out that you've been doing this terrible thing of cheating on your spouse. That serves as a red flag. So in cases where you are tempted, and a temptation consists essentially of a lesser good being presented in an outsized way as being much more good than it is, causing you to focus on the lesser good to the exclusion of other goods, and that's a temptation. In that temptation, this is where especially the red flags, both your habituation and what you focus on, and the red flags of this is not something you should be doing become especially helpful to cause you to pull back from your sort of tunnel vision view of the lesser good into remembering the bigger picture, and that helps to keep you from doing that evil act. The same thing can be true of, murdering somebody in revenge or what have you, greater, bigger evils, lesser evils, etc. The same thing holds true of small evils as well. So, here we come to what are the effects of joking. Well, there are two main effects that are relevant here to joking about evil. One of them is that the joking about evil, and this is somewhat the lesser one first, causes you to think about the smaller good. And because there's a lot of time being spent on it and so on, because there's a certain amount of breaking of taboos, etc., this tends to suggest, the nature of joking, especially also because it attaches the happiness of laughter and camaraderie and so on, it tends to sort of add a luster to the lesser good that you could choose in preference to the greater good. A luster to this, to make it seem more outsized than it is. That's the lesser effect. The bigger effect is it gets you used to thinking about this thing without the red flags. And it's precisely because it's, I'm just joking, don't worry about it, don't take it so seriously, it's just a joke. And it is, in itself, just a joke. And so a person should not react to a joke about, say, adultery, a joke about cheating on your wife or cheating on your husband. Like, man, what I heard was, a woman talking about, Robert Redford, if she gets to meet him, tell her husband that, it's nice knowing him. That's a joke about adultery. Well, it's not that you should then ostracize that person as if they were an adulterer. But at the same time, the problem comes in if there's no reaction, then the person has associated that idea of adultery without the red flags coming up. Now, just one time doesn't really do anything. As where, judgment comes in. But if this happens over and over again, if this becomes a drumbeat, if this becomes part of popular entertainment, what happens is you get this thing over and over and over again where you keep on thinking about adultery, and instead of thinking about the red flags, about the cultural opprobrium and so on, you think about all the happy good things of the joking, and then no one really minded when it was joking and so on. And you would never put together a logical argument. People laughed when I made a joke about adultery, therefore they won't mind if I cheat on my wife. No one's going to do anything that absurd. I mean, if you're at that level, you're just going to think, I want it, therefore I shall do it, and screw everyone else. Which people do. But that's not, you wouldn't put together some sort of logical argument, but rather you are becoming acclimated to thinking about adultery without thinking about the shame attached to adultery, without thinking about any of those red flags being attached to adultery. And so what happens over time is if you get put in that circumstance to be tempted, the really, sympathetic, handsome man, the really, beautiful younger woman, whatever it is, and using adultery just because it's reasonably clear, but, all too common in our society anyway, or societies throughout the world, I should say. So you start to think about this thing, and then when you get put in the real circumstance, as a temptation, the red flags don't really come up very much, because you've had so much exposure to this without any of that association, that in your animal habituation, the various things that you would have been or had originally been conditioned to think of, you're no longer conditioned to think of. They don't come up. So, they're kind of like, a dull, pinkish gray flag off in the distance. Maybe even that much. In really, really extreme circumstances, you could even go kind of so far as to almost have the fun of the thing, of the joking, the camaraderie of the joking, the excitement of it predominate, thinking about like, ooh, I'm breaking a taboo, this is great. And, in some place in your rational mind thinking like, well, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. But, our rational minds control our behavior to greater and lesser extents, and far less than they should, being fallen creatures. And so this is how joking about evil, it gets you accustomed to it. It gets it so that in cases of, it's not that, if you're not tempted, you would then go out and seek it. It's not that, joking about it will, push you where there is no other stimulus, but it's where you are being pulled by some sort of temptation, joking about it. And I'm talking about, constant drumbeat of joking about, an evil, substantially reduces your ability to resist that temptation. So again, it's not a sufficient cause. It's not deterministic that it will do this, but it is absolutely the case that it can make it much harder to resist temptation. And there's another thing too that sort of plays in, because we have finite amounts of energy, and so if you spend a tremendous amount of energy resisting one temptation, you don't have that much energy to resist other temptations. And if you have weakened your resistance to some temptations through joking, especially if you joke about all sorts of different kinds of evil, if you have massively, significantly reduced your resistance to some temptations such that it requires more willpower, more effort to not give in to some temptations, you are then going to be tired and have less effort to put into resisting other temptations. Which is, again, still not deterministic. There is such a thing as heroic virtue. But, sort of in the common case, where one is striving mightily to be a saint, one can overcome, with God's help, anything. But, any temptation, I mean. But, that said, where one isn't that good, reducing one's mental energy for overcoming temptation in one place is going to weaken you in the face of other temptations. It's one reason to try to avoid temptations in general, because they weaken you with regard to other temptations. And if you can avoid some temptations, you're much better off avoiding the ones you can avoid, so that you have your reserve of strength for the ones you can't avoid. Joking about evil and things like that can very easily put you in that circumstance by whatever temptations you can avoid, massively reducing your resistance to them, massively upping the amount of energy you have to put, making you far tireder and thus much more susceptible to other of the temptations you can't avoid. So basically that is the main sort of way that joking about evil can predispose you to evil. Not always to the evil that you're joking about. It's just described in terms of, weakening you and so on. The other thing too, actually, it's kind of related, is it's all too easy to start giving yourself credit for not doing the things that you see constantly by joking about them. Like, well, I don't, joke about this a lot, but I don't do it, so I'm doing pretty well, which then can easily help you to rationalize other different evils that you might give into. Because hey, at least you're not doing this big terrible thing that you're constantly thinking about. So one other way as well. So when you put all of it together, it's not that one should be a killjoy, but on the flip side, one does have to ask, how incompetent are you at telling jokes that the only jokes you can tell are all ones about people being extremely vicious? There are lots of actually, happy subjects in the world. Wordplay and all sorts of great things that don't involve contemplating evil acts and giving in to evil acts and so on. Especially evil acts of a sexual nature, those are the most popular. But there are others as well. Theft. Hear a fair amount of joking about theft too. Occasionally revenge and other things. On the flip side, I'm certainly not suggesting being a killjoy, and I'm not suggesting that anyone should react to a joke as if it was doing exactly the thing that it joked about. At the same time, there are lots of ways of being funny. There are all sorts of ways of having a good time that don't involve this sort of thing. And so, it's developing one's competence in those other things to the exclusion, to crowd out the other worst sort of joking certainly is time well spent. Laughing is very good. I'm very fond of laughing. I'm very fond of helping, making other people laugh. Good reason, by the way, to try to become good at being easily amused. If you are, you laugh more. It also means you're less desperate. Being easily amused also means, by the way, that you are less desperate for stimulation and therefore have to go to things like, flirting with, breaking with taboos to get enough stimulation to actually laugh. So overall, it's a very good idea to try to be easily amused. Just spend your life happier. And anyway, it's this sort of thing, not to try to, put on your Puritan hat with the belt buckle on your head and, frown at everybody. But, emphasize the good, just starve the bad through lack of attention. And you can make some pretty significant changes without ever having to frown at anybody. So, hope that helps. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.